Captain Elena Vasquez stared at the tactical display, watching red dots multiply across the holographic star map like a spreading infection. Each dot represented another fallen world, another species that had vanished into the maw of something the galaxy's greatest minds couldn't even properly name. The Devourers, some called them. The Endless Hunger. Others whispered in the dark corners of space stations. But names didn't matter when entire solar systems went silent in a matter of hours. "Captain!" her communications officer called out, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We're receiving priority transmissions from the Galactic Council. They're calling for an emergency session." Elena didn't turn from the display. She'd been expecting this call for weeks, ever since the first reports started trickling in from the Outer Rim. The Zephyrians had been the first to spot them, massive biomechanical entities that seemed to consume not just organic matter, but the very essence of worlds themselves. Planets left in their wake weren't just dead. They were hollow, empty spheres of rock that had been stripped of everything that had ever made them alive. "Put it through," she said, finally turning to face the main screen as it flickered to life. The familiar chamber of the Galactic Council appeared before her, though it looked different now. Where once hundreds of representatives from dozens of species had gathered in unity, now perhaps 50 beings huddled in small groups, their body language speaking of fear and desperation. At the center of it all stood Chancellor HFY, his normally pristine blue skin now bearing the stress marks of his people when faced with existential threat. Representatives of the surviving civilizations. HFY began, his voice carrying across the chamber with forced authority. "We face an unprecedented crisis. The entities now sweeping through our galaxy have proven immune to every weapon we possess. Our most advanced fleets have been consumed as easily as a child might eat candy. Entire star nations have fallen silent." Elena listened as the Chancellor listed the losses. The Corvin Empire gone, the Silicon Federation silent, the Nexus worlds evacuated, their populations scattered to whatever refugee ships could carry them. With each name, she saw the assembled representatives grow smaller, more frightened. "We have calculated that at their current rate of expansion," HFY continued, "these entities will reach the core worlds within 6 standard months. Our projections show a 97% probability of total galactic extinction within 2 years." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Elena had seen the same projections. She'd run them herself on humanity's most advanced quantum computers, hoping for different numbers. The results had been even worse. "However," the Chancellor said, raising his hand for silence, "we have identified one potential solution. One species whose territory these entities have approached, but not yet entered. One civilization that may possess resources we have overlooked." Elena felt her stomach tighten. She knew what was coming next. "We formally request the assistance of the Human Federation," HFY announced. "Your species has shown remarkable ingenuity in the past. Perhaps you can see a solution that has escaped the rest of us." The chamber fell silent. Elena could feel the weight of hundreds of alien gazes upon her through the quantum link, even though most of them weren't physically present. She thought of Earth, her homeworld, with its blue oceans and green continents. She thought of the colonies, New Geneva with its crystal cities, Harmony Station where humans and aliens worked side by side, the mining worlds that fed humanity's expansion across the stars. But more than that, she thought of the debt. 300 years ago, when humanity had barely learned to build ships that could cross between star systems without falling apart, they had encountered their first alien refugees. The Zephyrians, fleeing some catastrophe in their home system, had arrived in soul space with failing life support and dying children. Earth's governments had been paralyzed with indecision, but individual humans had not. Volunteers had risked their lives to save alien children they'd never met. Engineers had worked for months without pay to repair Zephyrian ships with technology they barely understood. Doctors had figured out how to treat alien physiology through trial and error, sometimes making themselves sick in the process. The galaxy had called humanity naive. Stupid. A species too soft for the harsh realities of interstellar politics. Elena had met some of those Zephyrians. Their descendants now serve throughout human space, their unique sensory abilities making them invaluable as navigators and scouts. They had repaid humanity's kindness 1,000 times over, but Elena's people had never asked for repayment. That wasn't how humans worked. "Chancellor HFY," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly across the quantum link. "I need to know something before humanity can provide any assistance." "Of course, Captain. What do you require?" "I need to know exactly which species are still fighting these entities and which ones have given up." Confusion rippled through the chamber. Several representatives exchanged glances. clearly wondering why this mattered. I'm not sure I understand the relevance, Vex-High began. Answer the question, Chancellor. Elena's tone brooked no argument. She had learned early in her career that sometimes respect had to be demanded rather than requested. Vex-A consulted his datapad. The Altarian Union continues to mount resistance, though their losses have been severe. The Crystalline Collective maintains defensive positions around their core worlds. The Zephyrian Free States have been conducting guerrilla operations against the entities, though with limited success. Most other civilizations have either fallen or retreated to whatever safe positions they could find. Eleanor nodded slowly. The Altarians, they had provided crucial medical supplies during the Martian plague outbreak of 2387, saving millions of human lives when their own pharmaceutical companies had been overwhelmed. The Crystalline Collective had shared their advanced materials technology freely with human engineers, asking for nothing in return except friendship. And the Zephyrians, well, Elena's people owed them more than could ever be repaid. And the others, she asked? The ones who have retreated? The Corvan Empire, before they fell, did they ask for help when the entities first appeared in their territory? They. Vex-High paused, clearly uncomfortable. The Corvan Empire traditionally handles its own affairs. They did not request assistance. Elena knew the truth behind that diplomatic language. The Corvans had been one of the most powerful empires in the galaxy, and they had never let anyone forget it. When humanity had offered aid during the early attacks, the Corvan response had been swift and brutal. Humans were a minor species, barely qualified to exist in civilized space, and their offers of help were both unnecessary and insulting. The same had been true of most of the fallen civilizations. They had looked at humanity's small fleet, their primitive-seeming technology, their insistence on maintaining diplomatic relations even with their enemies, and they had laughed. Some had been more polite about it than others, but the message had always been the same. Humanity was too weak, too young, too naive to be of any real use. Elena had been present at more than one council session where human proposals had been dismissed without serious consideration. She remembered the Theran ambassador actually snorting with amusement when humanity had suggested a galaxy-wide early warning system for potential threats. "Leave security to the professionals," he had said, gesturing to the massive Theran warfleet displayed on the screens behind him. That fleet now existed only as scattered debris in the Theran home system. "Captain," Vex-A said, his voice now openly pleading. "I understand that there may be political considerations, but surely in the face of total extinction, past disagreements can be set aside?" Elena almost smiled. Even now, facing the end of everything, the Chancellor still didn't understand. He thought this was about politics, about wounded pride or diplomatic slights. He had no idea what was really about to happen. "Chancellor, I need you to send me a complete list of every species that has requested human assistance in the past 50 years, and every species that has declined such assistance. I also need casualty reports from every engagement with these entities, broken down by species and fleet composition. Captain, with respect, I fail to see how this historical data will help us develop a defense against—" "Get me the data, Chancellor, and while you're doing that, I need to make some calls." Elena cut the connection before Vex-A could respond. The bridge of her ship fell silent, except for the soft hum of the life support systems and the occasional beep from the sensor stations. "Ma'am," her tactical officer said quietly, "are we really going to help them after everything they've done to us?" Eleanor turned to look at him. Lieutenant Morrison was young, barely 30, but he'd been present at the Centauri incident, where 3 human ships had been destroyed by Corvan warning shots for entering what the Empire had arbitrarily declared to be restricted space. He'd lost friends in that attack. Friends whose only crime had been trying to deliver medical supplies to a plague-stricken world. "Lieutenant," Elena said softly, "we're not going to help them because of what they've done to us. We're going to help them despite what they've done to us. But first, we're going to help the species that helped us." She moved to her command chair and activated the ship's long-range communications array. "Communications. Get me a secure channel to Admiral Chen at Fleet Command. Priority Alpha authorization." As the connection established, Elena looked back at the tactical display where the red dots continued to multiply. Somewhere out there, in the darkness between stars, an ancient enemy was consuming everything in its path. The galaxy's greatest civilizations had fallen before it like wheat before the scythe. But they hadn't counted on humanity's greatest strength, a strength that every other species saw as a weakness. Humans never forgot a favor. More than that, they never forgot who their friends were, and they would move heaven and earth to protect them. The face of Admiral Chen appeared on her screen, his expression grim. Elena, I've been watching the reports. It's bad, isn't it? It's worse than bad, sir. But I think we might have a chance. I need you to activate the Remembrance Protocol. Admiral Chen's eyes widened. The Remembrance Protocol had been established over a century ago, but it had never been used. It was humanity's most closely guarded secret, a network of alliances and obligations that stretched across the galaxy like invisible threads. Are you certain? He asked. Once we activate it, there's no going back. Every favor we've ever done, every life we've saved, every hand we've extended in friendship, we'll be calling in all of it. Elena thought of the Zephyrian children she'd seen in the refugee camps during her academy days, their large eyes full of hope, despite everything they'd lost. She thought of the Altarian medics who had worked alongside human doctors during the plague, risking their own lives to save people they'd never met. She thought of 1,000 small acts of kindness, a million moments where humanity had chosen to help rather than exploit, to build rather than tear down. Yes, sir. It's time for the galaxy to learn what it means when humans never forget a favor. Admiral Chen nodded slowly. I'll start making the calls. How many do you think will answer? Elena smiled, and for the first time in weeks it was genuine. All of them, Admiral. Every single one. As the connection closed, Elena turned back to the tactical display. The red dots were still there, still spreading, still consuming everything in their path. But now she could see something else. Threads of blue light beginning to appear on the map, connecting star systems across the galaxy. Each thread represented a debt of honor, a favor remembered, a friendship that had endured across the centuries. The Devourers had faced the galaxy's greatest armies and consumed them without effort. They had shattered fleets and devoured worlds with casual ease, but they had never faced humanity's true weapon, the bonds forged not in conquest but in compassion, not in fear but in friendship. The galaxy was about to learn why humans never forgot a favor and why that made all the difference in the universe. Admiral Sarah Chen stood in the center of the operations room, deep beneath Lunar Base, surrounded by holographic displays that showed the current state of the galaxy. What she saw should have filled her with despair. Vast swaths of space now showed as dead zones, their stars still burning but their worlds stripped bare of life. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades of military service: anticipation. Status report, she called out to the room full of officers and analysts working frantically at their stations. Ma'am, called out Commander Williams from the communications station. We've successfully contacted 137 species through the Remembrance Network. 82 have confirmed they're mobilizing all available resources. 31 are requesting clarification of what we need from them. 24 are... He paused, checking his display. 24 are asking if this is really the time to call in old favors. Admiral Chen shook her head. Even facing extinction, some species couldn't get past their own political calculations. What about the primary contacts? The Zephyrians responded within minutes, ma'am. Ambassador Kethara says they're activating every ship they have, including civilian vessels. The Altarians have pledged their entire medical corps and 3 fleet divisions. The Crystalline Collective is already moving their mobile shipyards toward the rendezvous coordinates. Chen nodded, feeling the familiar warmth that came with seeing old friendships prove their worth. But those were the easy responses. Species that had worked closely with humanity for decades. The real test would come from the others. Ma'am, another voice called out. This time it was Lieutenant Kim from the analysis section. We're getting something unusual from the Vorth Confederation. Chen frowned. The Vorth were an ancient species, older than most civilizations in the galaxy. They were also notoriously isolationist, preferring to observe rather than participate in galactic affairs. Humanity had encountered them only once, during a rescue mission in the Kepler Nebula 70 years ago. What kind of unusual? They're asking for coordinates, ma'am. Not for a few ships, for their entire reserve fleet. According to our intelligence reports, that's over 3,000 vessels that haven't left their home system in over 2 centuries. Chen raised an eyebrow. The Vorth Reserve Fleet was legendary. Ships built with technology so advanced that most species couldn't even understand how they worked. If they were willing to commit that kind of firepower, what exactly did we do for the Vorth 70 years ago? She asked. Lieutenant Kim consulted his records. It was Captain Martinez on the exploration ship Endeavour. They found a Vorth science vessel that had been damaged in a solar storm. The Vorth crew was trapped in a collapsing quantum field. Martinez and his team spent 6 days manually stabilizing the field, working in shifts around the clock. 3 of our people died from radiation exposure, but they saved 47 VOR scientists. And now they're offering 3,000 ships, Chen mused. What did the VOR say when Captain Martinez tried to file a formal contact report? According to the records, they said, the debt is noted and will be remembered. Then they disappeared. No one's heard from them since until today. Chen felt a chill run down her spine. 70 years of silence, and now they were mobilizing their entire reserve fleet. Either the Vorth understood exactly how serious the current threat was, or they understood something about human nature that most species had missed. Ma'am? Commander Williams called out again. We're getting responses from species I didn't even know we'd helped. The Gossamer Collective is sending their dimensional ships. The Stone Speakers are mobilizing their planet crackers. And we just received a message from something calling itself the Harmony of Echoes. They're asking where to send their song ships, whatever those are. Chen walked over to the main tactical display, watching as more and more blue dots appeared across the star map. Each dot represented a species responding to humanity's call, bringing whatever ships and resources they could muster. Some were obvious: the Zephyrians, the Altarians, the dozen other species that maintained regular diplomatic relations with humanity, but others were complete surprises. Williams, pull up the file on the Harmony of Echoes. I want to know what we did for them. A few minutes later, Williams had the answer. It was 35 years ago, ma'am. The research ship Curie encountered them in the void sector. The Harmony are energy beings. They exist as sentient sound waves in the vacuum of space. A quantum storm was disrupting their frequencies, essentially lobotomizing their entire species. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Captain Vasquez's mother, actually figured out how to use the Curie's communications array to stabilize their harmonic patterns. How many of them? The entire species, ma'am. 14 billion sentient beings. Chen stared at the display. 14 billion lives saved by one human doctor with a communications array and a brilliant idea. And now they were offering their song ships to help fight an enemy that could devour planets. Admiral, came a new voice from across the room. This was Captain Torres from Intelligence. We're getting a response from the Eternals. The room went silent. The Eternals were perhaps the most mysterious species in the galaxy, ancient beings who existed partially outside normal space-time, observing the rise and fall of civilizations like humans might watch the changing of seasons. They never interfered, never participated in galactic politics, never even acknowledged the existence of younger species. What kind of response? Chen asked quietly. They say, and I quote, "The young species has proven worthy. The old compact will be honored. We will lend our sight to their cause." Old compact? What compact? Torres shook his head. I have no idea, ma'am. There's no record of any contact with the Eternals in our databases. Chen frowned, then activated her personal communication device. Get me Captain Vasquez, priority channel. A few minutes later, Elena's face appeared on the screen. She was still on her ship, still monitoring the spread of the Devourers across the galaxy. Elena. Chen said without preamble, "Do you know anything about an old compact with the Eternals?" Elena's expression shifted, becoming thoughtful. Not personally, but... Admiral, what do you know about my great-great-grandmother? Your what? Ana Vasquez. She was part of the first human deep space exploration program back when we were still using chemical rockets to reach other star systems. Family legend says she encountered something in the space between galaxies, but she never officially reported it. Chen felt another chill. The first deep space explorations had been over 4 centuries ago, when humanity was barely capable of interstellar travel. What could Ana Vasquez have encountered out there? Elena, I need you to check your family records. If there's any truth to that legend. Already on it, Admiral. I'll have my sister pull everything from the family archives. But Admiral, there's something else you should know. What? The evacuation of the Corvan Empire wasn't as complete as they reported. My scouts have identified 17 refugee convoys still trying to escape the Devourer zone. They're requesting immediate assistance. Chen paused. The Corvans, the same species that had dismissed human offers of help with contempt, that had attacked human ships for entering their space, that had consistently voted against human proposals in the Galactic Council. What's their condition? Bad. Really bad. They've got maybe 48 hours before the Devourers reach them. Their escort ships are falling apart, their life support is failing, and they've got civilians aboard, families, children. Chen closed her eyes for a moment. This was the test, wasn't it? The real measure of what humanity stood for. Not just helping their friends, but helping everyone, even their enemies. Elena, how many ships would we need to divert to get them out? Maybe a dozen fast cruisers with our new drive systems. We could reach them in time, but it would mean taking those ships away from the main effort. Yes, ma'am. Chen opened her eyes and looked around the operations room. Every person there was watching her, waiting for her decision. She could see the question in their eyes. Why should humanity risk their ships and their people to save a species that had never shown them anything but contempt? But that was exactly the point, wasn't it? That was what separated humanity from every other species in the galaxy. The ability to do the right thing, not because it was easy, not because it was profitable, not even because it was smart, but because it was right. Elena, dispatch the rescue ships. Get those refugees to safety. Yes, ma'am. As the connection closed, Chen turned back to the tactical display. The blue dots representing allied species continued to multiply, but now she could see something else. Green dots representing human ships moving throughout the galaxy, not toward the enemy, but toward anyone who needed help. Rescue missions, medical evacuations, supply runs to isolated colonies that had been cut off by the advancing devourers. Admiral, Commander Williams called out, we're getting a transmission from the Galactic Council. Chancellor Vexai is demanding to know why human ships are scattered across the galaxy instead of concentrating for a unified defense. Chen activated the communications array and Chancellor Vexai's image appeared on the main screen. His stress marks had darkened considerably since their last conversation. Admiral Chen, he began without preamble, our intelligence shows human vessels throughout the galaxy, but not where they should be. Why are you not concentrating your forces at the primary defensive positions? Because we're busy, Chancellor. Busy? Busy with what? The enemy advances while you waste time on meaningless? Chen's voice carried a dangerous edge. Tell me, Chancellor, what do you consider meaningless? The 14 medical ships we've dispatched to treat plague victims on Altus Prime? The supply convoy bringing food to the refugee camps in the Belta system? Or perhaps the rescue ships saving Corvan civilians that your own people abandoned? Vexai's stress marks flickered with what might have been embarrassment.
Admiral, while these actions are
admirable, surely the defense of the core worlds takes priority? The core worlds, Chancellor, are defended by ideas, not just weapons. And the most important idea is that some things are worth defending not because they belong to you, but because they're right. Before the Chancellor could respond, another voice cut into the communication. It was Ambassador Kethara, of the Zephyrian Free States, her crystalline features flickering with the bioluminescent patterns that indicated deep emotion. Chancellor Vekaivi, she said, her voice carrying the harmonics that made Zephyrian speech so distinctive. With respect, you do not understand what you are witnessing. The humans are not scattered randomly across the galaxy. They are activating something that your people have never possessed. A network of genuine loyalty built over centuries of selfless action. Ambassador, I hardly think this is the time for philosophy. It is exactly the time, Kethara interrupted. Do you know why my people follow the humans? Not because they are the strongest, not because they are the richest, but because 300 years ago, when we were dying in the void between stars, they chose to save us rather than exploit us. Every species responding to their call today has the same story. Another voice joined the conversation. This one belonged to Crystalline Prime Resonance, the leader of the Crystalline Collective. When a Crystalline spoke, their words came not as sound but as pure meaning, transmitted directly to the listener's mind, and the meaning that came through now was absolute certainty. The humans understand what you do not, Chancellor. This is not a war that can be won with weapons alone. The Devourers consume not just matter and energy, but purpose itself. They feed on the despair and isolation of their victims, but they cannot consume what the humans have built. Bonds of trust that span the galaxy, debts of honor that time cannot erode. Chen felt a surge of pride, but also of responsibility. These beings were placing their faith in humanity, not just because of what humans could do, but because of what they represented. The idea that sentient beings could choose cooperation over competition, trust over suspicion, hope over fear.
Chancellor, said softly.
Every ship we have scattered across the galaxy is exactly where it needs to be. They're not just saving lives, they're proving that something in this universe is worth saving. And when we face the Devourers, every being we've helped will remember that. They'll fight not just for their own survival, but for the survival of something bigger than themselves. The communication ended, leaving Chen alone with her thoughts and the tactical display. The red dots representing the Devourers continued their inexorable advance, but now they were matched by an ever-growing constellation of blue and green dots, allied species, and human ships spreading throughout the galaxy like antibodies fighting an infection. Her communication device chimed, and Elena's face reappeared on the screen. "Admiral, I've got those family records you wanted. And ma'am, you're not going to believe what my great-great-grandmother found out there." Chen leaned forward. "Try me." She encountered the Eternals, but not like we think of them now. According to her logs, they were refugees themselves, fleeing something called the First Hunger. They were dying, their time-stream technologies failing. Great-great-grandmother Anna somehow jury-rigged a temporal stabilizer, using parts from 3 different alien ships and her own wedding ring. Her wedding ring? It was made from a rare isotope that resonated with temporal fields. She used it as a focusing crystal. The point is, Admiral, she saved them. The Eternals exist in their current form because a human woman 4 centuries ago refused to let them die. Chen stared at the display, seeing it with new eyes. The Eternals, beings who existed partially outside of time, who could see the rise and fall of civilizations across the centuries. They had been watching humanity ever since, waiting to see if humans would remain true to the compassion that had saved them so long ago. "Elena," she said quietly, "how long before the Devourers reach the core worlds?" "At current rate of advance, about 4 months, Admiral." "And how long before all our scattered ships can rendezvous at the primary defensive position?" 3.5 months, if we push the engines to maximum." Chen nodded. "It would be close, but it might just work." Humanity's greatest gamble, that scattered acts of kindness performed across centuries of history, would unite the galaxy against a threat that could consume everything. "Elena, send out the final call. Every species, every ship, every favor we've ever done. Tell them it's time to come home." As the orders went out across the galaxy, Chen allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The Devourers had faced the galaxy's greatest fleets and destroyed them. They had consumed entire star nations without pause, but they had never faced anything like what was coming for them now. 3 months had passed since Admiral Chen activated the Remembrance Protocol, and the Kepler defense platform buzzed with activity unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Captain Elena Vasquez stood on the observation deck, watching as ships from across the known universe continued to arrive at the massive staging area humanity had constructed in the space between stars. It was a sight that defied every law of galactic politics she'd ever learned. Zephyrian scout ships flew in formation with Altarian medical frigates. The massive stone ships of the Stone Speaker civilization drifted alongside the gossamer-thin vessels of the Collective that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Even more remarkable were the ships she couldn't identify, vessels from species so obscure that humanity had no formal diplomatic relations with them. Yet they had come anyway. "Ma'am," her communications officer called out, "we're receiving a final transmission from the Vorth Confederation. Their entire reserve fleet has just completed their transit. 3,047 vessels, all requesting assignment to the primary battle group." Elena shook her head in amazement. 3,000 ships that hadn't seen combat in 2 centuries, mobilized because humanity had once saved a damaged science vessel. The math of gratitude was unlike anything else in the universe. "What's our current total?" she asked. "Ma'am, we're approaching 12,000 ships from 193 different species. That doesn't count the auxiliaries. Medical ships, supply vessels, mobile shipyards, and what the Harmony of Echoes are calling resonance amplifiers. 12,000 ships." Elena remembered studying the greatest space battles in galactic history during her academy days. The Battle of Rigel Centauri, largest fleet engagement ever recorded, had involved perhaps 800 vessels total. What was assembling here wasn't just the largest fleet in history, it was larger than all previous fleets combined. But numbers alone wouldn't be enough. The Devourers had proven that conventional weapons were useless against them. Even the most advanced plasma cannons and quantum torpedoes seemed to feed their hunger rather than harm them. Whatever they were going to face these entities with, it would have to be something completely different. "Captain," came a new voice from behind her. Eleanor turned to see Dr. Polonier, Marcus Webb, the head of humanity's Xenobiology Research Division. He looked exhausted, but there was an excitement in his eyes that she'd never seen before. "Doctor, please tell me you have good news." "Better than good, Captain. We've had a breakthrough." He activated a portable holographic display showing a complex 3-dimensional model that hurt Elena's eyes to look at directly. "We've been analyzing the reports from every engagement with the Devourers, and we found something interesting."
Elena leaned closer. trying to make sense of the swirling patterns in the hologram.
What am I looking at? Failure points, Webb said with satisfaction. Every time the Devourers have encountered something unexpected, there's been a momentary disruption in their feeding pattern. It only lasts microseconds, but it's consistent. What kind of unexpected things? Usually acts of sacrifice. Ships ramming Devourer entities to save others. Crews overloading their reactors to buy evacuation time. The more irrational the act of self-sacrifice, the longer the disruption lasts. Eleanor frowned. That doesn't make sense. Why would acts of sacrifice affect entities that feed on matter and energy? Because they don't just feed on matter and energy, Captain. They feed on purpose, on the meaning that sentient beings give to existence. When someone sacrifices themselves for others, especially for people they don't even know, it creates a kind of conceptual paradox. The Devourers can't process it. Elena stared at the display, beginning to understand. They're not just consuming planets. They're consuming the idea that life has meaning. Exactly. And acts of selfless sacrifice are the opposite of that idea. They're proof that some things matter more than individual survival. Webb manipulated the hologram, showing the disruption patterns in greater detail. But here's the really interesting part, the effect scales. The more people involved in the act of sacrifice, the more species represented, the bigger the disruption. Elena felt her pulse quicken. Doctor, are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that what we have here, 12,000 ships from nearly 200 species, all willing to risk everything for people they've never met, might be exactly the weapon we need. Before Elena could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the platform. She rushed to the nearest communication station as urgent messages flooded in from the perimeter sensors. Captain! Her tactical officer's voice crackled over the intercom. Long-range sensors are detecting massive gravitational distortions in the outer system. It's them, ma'am. They're here. Elena felt ice form in her stomach. According to their projections, the Devourers weren't supposed to reach this position for another 3 weeks. If they were arriving early, how many? She asked. We're counting at least 50 individual entities, each one approximately the size of a small moon. They're moving in perfect formation, approaching at 60% light speed. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, running calculations in her head. 50 entities, each capable of consuming an entire planet, moving faster than any ship in the combined fleet could match. And they still had ships arriving from across the galaxy, vessels that wouldn't reach their defensive position in time. All ships, she broadcast on the general frequency. This is Captain Vasquez. Enemy contact in approximately 6 hours. All vessels are to assume defensive positions immediately. As she spoke, she watched the tactical display update with the positions of the Allied fleet. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Ships from across the galaxy moving with practiced precision, despite the fact that most of these species had never worked together before. But something was wrong. The formation was too spread out, too defensive. Against an enemy like the Devourers, trying to protect everything would mean protecting nothing. Ma'am, came another voice from the communication station. We're receiving a priority transmission from Ambassador Cathara. She says it's urgent. Elena activated the communication link, and the familiar crystalline features of the Zephyrian ambassador appeared on her screen. But Cathara looked different now. Her bioluminescent patterns were shifting in ways Elena had never seen before. Captain, Cathara said without preamble, I must speak with you about something my people have not shared with the rest of the galaxy. Something we learned 300 years ago, when your ancestors first saved us. Ambassador, we're about to face the biggest battle in galactic history. Unless this is directly relevant. It is, Cathara interrupted. Captain, the disaster that drove my people from our homeworld, it wasn't a natural catastrophe. It was them. The Devourers. We were the first species to survive an encounter with them. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. The Zephyrians had been running from the Devourers for 3 centuries? Why hadn't they said anything? We didn't speak of it because we thought we were the only survivors, Cathara continued. We thought they had been destroyed when our star went nova. But if they're here now, they followed you, Elena whispered. 300 years ago, they followed the refugee ships into human space. But why didn't they attack then? Because of what your people did for us, Cathara said, her patterns shifting to what Elena recognized as profound gratitude. The Devourers feed on despair, on the breakdown of meaning and purpose. But when humans saved us, when they chose to help rather than exploit, it created something the Devourers couldn't process. A dead zone in their feeding pattern. Elena's mind raced. If the Devourers had been held back by humanity's act of compassion 3 centuries ago, then Dr. Webb was right. Acts of sacrifice, of selfless compassion, really could disrupt their feeding. Ambassador, how long do you think this dead zone has lasted? Until now, apparently. Something has changed, Captain. Something has made them strong enough to overcome the barrier your ancestors created. Helena didn't need to ask what had changed. She'd seen the reports from across the galaxy. The rise of authoritarianism, the breakdown of cooperation between species, the increasing focus on individual survival over collective good. The galaxy had been growing darker for decades, feeding the very despair that made the Devourers stronger. But now, Elena looked out at the assembled fleet, at ships from nearly 200 species working together despite centuries of mistrust and conflict. She thought of the thousands of individual acts of kindness that had brought them here. Humans saving alien refugees, alien species sharing technology freely, entire civilizations putting aside their own interests to fight for something bigger than themselves. "Ma'am," her tactical officer called out, 5 hours to contact. The Devourers are maintaining course and speed. Elena activated the fleet-wide communications array. When she spoke, her words would be heard by every ship in the assembled armada, humans and aliens, old friends and former enemies, species that had been at war with each other just months ago. "This is Captain Elena Vasquez, to all ships of the Allied Defense Fleet," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the quantum communication network. "In 5 hours, we will face an enemy unlike any in galactic history. An enemy that feeds not just on our worlds, but on our despair. An enemy that grows stronger when we act out of fear and selfishness." She paused, looking out at the constellation of ships surrounding the platform. "But they have never faced anything like what we've built here. Not just the largest fleet in history, but something more important. Proof that sentient beings can choose cooperation over competition, hope over fear, and sacrifice over survival. Every ship in this fleet is here because somewhere in the past humans chose to help rather than exploit. And every one of you chose to answer that call, not because you had to, but because it was right." The communication channel crackled with responses in dozens of languages, but Elena could sense the common thread running through all of them. Determination mixed with something approaching awe at what they were about to attempt. "The Devourers think meaning is an illusion," Elena continued. "They think purpose is a weakness. They're about to learn that they're wrong. They're about to face the most meaningful act in the history of the galaxy. Nearly 200 species choosing to stand together, not because they have to, but because some things are worth defending." Elena closed the communication and turned back to Dr. Webb, who had been listening intently. "Doctor, you said the disruption effect scales with the number of people involved. What happens when nearly 12,000 ships perform a coordinated act of sacrifice?"
Webb's eyes widened as he understood what she was suggesting.
"Captain, if your theory is correct, if every ship in this fleet were to simultaneously overload their reactors in a coordinated pattern, would it be enough to destroy them? I don't know. But it might be enough to disrupt them long enough for the Eternals to act." Elena frowned. "The Eternals? What do they have to do with this?" "Captain, the Eternals exist partially outside normal time, right? If we can create a large enough disruption in the Devourer's feeding pattern, the Eternals might be able to use their temporal abilities to unmake the Devourer's existence." Elena stared at him. It was insane. It was impossible. It was exactly the kind of plan that humanity was famous for. The kind that every other species in the galaxy would dismiss as naive and stupid. The kind that just might work. "Get me Admiral Chen," she said. "And then get me every ship captain in this fleet. We need to talk." The largest military conference in galactic history took place not in a grand council chamber, but in the cramped communication center of the Kepler defense platform. Holographic projections filled every available space as representatives from nearly 200 species gathered virtually to hear Captain Elena Vasquez explain what might be the most audacious plan ever conceived. "Ladies, gentlemen, and sentient beings of all classifications,"
Elena began, looking out at the sea of alien faces surrounding her.
"what I'm about to propose will sound insane. It will go against every principle of military strategy you've ever learned, and it will require every one of us to sacrifice everything." Ambassador Kithara's crystalline features flickered with bioluminescent patterns that Elena now recognized as deep concern. "Captain, you spoke of a coordinated sacrifice. What exactly do you mean?" Elena took a deep breath. I mean every ship in this fleet simultaneously overloading their reactors in a synchronized detonation pattern designed to create the largest disruption in space-time that has ever been attempted. The silence that followed was profound. Elena could see shock on faces that were capable of expressing it, and sensor readings indicated similar emotional states from species whose emotions weren't visually apparent. Finally, Prime Resonance of the Crystalline Collective spoke, their thoughts transmitted directly into the minds of everyone present. You are proposing that we destroy ourselves to hurt them. This is not strategy. This is suicide. No, Elena replied firmly. This is sacrifice. And there's a difference. She activated the holographic display that Dr. Webb had prepared, showing the disruption patterns they'd discovered in devourer feeding behaviors. The devourers feed on despair, on the breakdown of meaning and purpose. But acts of genuine sacrifice create disruptions in their feeding pattern. Dr. Webb, would you explain? Dr. Webb stepped forward, his voice carrying across the quantum communication network to every ship in the fleet. We've analyzed every engagement with the devourers over the past year. In every case where crews sacrificed themselves to save others, we've detected momentary disruptions in devourer energy absorption.
The more irrational the sacrifice, the more it defied simple survival logic, the larger the disruption.
A new voice cut through the discussion.
It belonged to war leader Thex of the Corvan Empire, one of the few high-ranking Corvans who had survived the destruction of their homeworld. Doctor, with respect, even if these disruptions occur, what makes you think they would be sufficient to actually harm these entities? Elena exchanged a glance with Dr. Force. Webb. This was the part of the plan that even she found hard to believe. Because we won't be fighting alone, she said simply. The Eternals have promised to lend their sight to our cause. If we can create a disruption large enough, if nearly 12,000 ships from 200 species simultaneously prove that meaning and purpose are more powerful than individual survival, the Eternals believe they can use their temporal abilities to erase the Devourers from existence. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Dozens of voices spoke at once in languages that the universal translators struggled to process. Eleanor could hear everything from outrage to amazement to what sounded suspiciously like several different species equivalents of laughter. Silence. The command came from an unexpected source, Eternal Observer First, whose presence suddenly manifested as a shimmering distortion in the communication field. The Eternals rarely spoke directly to younger species, and when they did, their words carried the weight of eons. The human speaks truth, the Eternal said.
Their voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once.
The entities you call devourers are not native to this reality. They are refugees from the collapse of a previous universe, beings who escaped extinction by learning to feed on the meaning that gives existence purpose. Elena felt a chill run through her. They're from another universe entirely? Yes. And they have consumed 17 galaxies across this reality, always growing stronger as civilizations fall into despair and meaninglessness. But they have a weakness that they do not understand. They cannot process genuine altruism. It creates paradoxes in their feeding logic that cause temporary disruptions in their existence. Prime Resonance's thoughts flickered with what might have been hope. And if we create a large enough disruption, if nearly 12,000 sentient beings simultaneously choose to sacrifice their existence for the survival of others, not their own species, but all species, the paradox will be sufficient for us to act. We exist partially outside time. We can reach backward to the moment before they entered this reality and adjust their trajectory. War leader Thex's voice carried skepticism that translated clearly across species lines. And what guarantee do we have that this will work? That our sacrifice will not be meaningless? You have the word of beings who have observed the rise and fall of 10,000 civilizations, the Eternal replied. But more than that, you have something unprecedented in galactic history. A species that has spent centuries proving that some things matter more than individual survival. Elena looked around at the assembled representatives. She could see the calculation in their eyes, the struggle between survival instinct and something larger. These were beings from across the galaxy, many of whom had been enemies until recently, all trying to decide whether to trust humanity's vision of what the universe could be. I know what you're thinking, Elena said softly. You're wondering if humans are naive, if our obsession with helping others, with remembering favors and honoring debts, is really just a weakness that we've dressed up as virtue. She paused, thinking of her great-great-grandmother Anna, who had saved beings she'd never met with nothing but a jury-rigged device and her own wedding ring.
She thought of the countless humans who had made similar choices over the centuries, who had chosen to help rather than exploit, to build rather than tear down.
Maybe we are too trusting, too willing to help, too slow to forget kindness. But if that's naivety, then it's the kind of naivety that brought 12,000 ships to defend a galaxy that has never fully accepted us.
It's the kind of naivety that convinced nearly 200 species to answer our call for help. And it's the kind of naivety that's about to prove that meaning and purpose are more powerful than hunger and despair. Ambassador Kithara was the first to respond. The Zephyrian Free States will follow humanity's lead.
You saved us 3 centuries ago when you had nothing to gain from it. If you say this sacrifice has meaning, then we trust that meaning. One by one, other voices joined in. The Altarians, whose medics had worked alongside human doctors during the plague years. The Crystalline Collective, whose advanced materials had helped humanity build better ships and habitats. Species that Elena had never heard of, whose first contact with humanity had been a human ship bringing medical supplies or rescue equipment, or simply a message that they were not alone in the universe. But the most surprising response came from War Leader Thex. The Corvan Empire has little reason to trust human judgment, he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of conflict. Your species has cost us much through your naive interference in matters beyond your understanding, but... He paused, and Elena could see something shifting in his expression. But when our homeworld fell, when our fleets were scattered and our people were dying, it was human ships that came to save our refugees. Not because you had to, not because we asked, but because it was right. My own daughter owes her life to a human medical team that spent 3 days straight keeping her alive when our own doctors had given up. War Leader Thex's voice grew stronger. If humans say this sacrifice has meaning, then perhaps it does. The Corvan survivors will stand with you. Elena felt tears forming in her eyes. The Corvans, who had been humanity's enemies for decades, were willing to die alongside them based on nothing more than trust earned through acts of compassion. All ships, Elena broadcast on the fleet-wide communication network. You have 1 hour to make final preparations. Send any personal messages you need to send. Make your peace with whatever gods or philosophies you follow. And remember that what we're about to do has never been attempted in the history of the galaxy. She paused, looking out at the constellation of ships that surrounded the platform. But also remember that it couldn't have been attempted by anyone else. This fleet exists because humans chose compassion over exploitation, because we built relationships based on trust rather than fear, and because when we gave our word, we kept it. Every favor we ever did, every hand we ever extended in friendship, every time we chose to help rather than ignore. It all led to this moment. As the communication closed, Elena turned to Dr. Fogel. Webb, who was making final adjustments to the synchronization equipment. Doctor, be honest with me. What are our actual odds? Webb looked up from his instruments, his face showing the exhaustion of the past weeks, but also something else. A kind of quiet confidence. Captain, based on everything we know about Devourer feeding patterns and the Eternal's temporal abilities, I'd say our odds are approximately 0. This plan violates every known law of physics and strategy. Elena felt her heart sink. But, it also violates every assumption the Devourers have made about how sentient species behave. They've been feeding on civilizations for eons, always seeing the same patterns: fear, despair, the breakdown of cooperation when survival is threatened. They've never encountered anything like what we're about to do. Webb smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it reached his eyes. Captain, they're about to learn that humans really don't forget favors. And that when we keep our promises, we keep them completely. Elena nodded, turning back to the observation window. In the distance, she could see the approaching shapes of the Devourer entities. Massive biomechanical forms that seemed to bend space around them simply by existing. They moved with the confidence of predators who had never encountered effective resistance. But they had never faced humanity before. They had never faced a species that considered death not as weakness but as strength, that saw sacrifice not as loss but as meaning, that could inspire nearly 200 other species to willingly die for strangers they would never meet.
All ships. Elena broadcast one final time.
This is Captain Elena Vasquez. Whatever happens in the next few minutes, know that you are part of something unprecedented in galactic history. Not just the largest fleet ever assembled, but the largest act of faith ever attempted. She took a deep breath, watching as the Devourer entities continued their approach.
Humanity never forgot a favor, and the galaxy answered our call. Now let's show them what that really means. The final moments before the largest sacrifice in galactic history were surprisingly quiet. Captain Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching the tactical display as nearly 12,000 ships from across the galaxy moved into their final positions. Each vessel was now a weapon unlike any that had ever been conceived, not designed to destroy the enemy, but to destroy themselves in service of something greater. All ships report ready, Captain, her communications officer announced. Reactor overload sequences are programmed and synchronized. We're at 97% participation. Elena raised an eyebrow. What about the other 3%? The Gossamer Collective ships, ma'am. They're saying their dimensional drives don't work the same way as conventional reactors. They're asking if they can contribute by collapsing their connection to 17 parallel dimensions simultaneously instead. Elena almost smiled, despite the gravity of the situation. Even at the end of everything, the universe found ways to surprise her. Tell them yes. Any form of catastrophic energy release that's done with the right intention should work. Through the observation windows, she could see the approaching devourer entities more clearly now. They were even more massive than the reports had suggested. Each one easily the size of Earth's moon. Their surfaces writhing with biomechanical tendrils that seemed to reach out hungrily toward the assembled fleet. As they moved, space itself appeared to bend around them, stars dimming as their light was somehow absorbed before it could escape. But there was something else Elena could see now, something that Dr. Webb's instruments were confirming on the sensor displays. The entities were slowing down. Captain, Webb called out from his station. I'm reading massive confusion patterns from the Devourer formations. Their feeding signatures are fluctuating wildly. Confusion? Why would they be confused? Because this is impossible, came a new voice. Elena turned to see Eternal Observer first materializing on her bridge, their form shifting between dimensions in ways that made her eyes water. In 17 galaxies, across millions of years, they have never encountered anything like this. Elena looked back at the tactical display, seeing it now through the Eternal's perspective. What the Devourers saw wasn't just a fleet of ships preparing to fight them. It was nearly 12,000 vessels from 200 different species, all preparing to die for beings they'd never met, defending worlds that weren't their own, fighting for the abstract concept that existence had meaning beyond individual survival. They don't understand it, Elena realized. They literally cannot process what they're seeing. Correct, the Eternal replied. The Devourers evolved in a universe where entropy had reached its final stages. Every civilization they encountered in that dying reality fell into despair and meaninglessness. They learned to feed on that despair, but they never developed the ability to understand its opposite. Elena's communication system chimed with an incoming transmission. The face that appeared on her screen was one she'd hoped never to see again. Chancellor Vexai, calling from what appeared to be a luxury evacuation ship safely beyond the combat zone. Captain Vasquez, the Chancellor began, his stress marks darker than she'd ever seen them. I'm receiving reports that your fleet is preparing to destroy itself. Surely there must be some alternative strategy we haven't considered. Elena looked at him for a long moment, thinking of all the council sessions where human proposals had been dismissed. All the times humanity's offers of help had been rejected with condescension. All the warnings about galactic threats that had been ignored. Chancellor, she said quietly, there is an alternative strategy. You could have implemented it centuries ago by choosing cooperation over competition, by building relationships based on trust rather than fear, by treating other species as partners rather than rivals. But you didn't. You chose the path that led us here. Captain, surely you don't intend to sacrifice your entire fleet for species that have shown you little gratitude. No, Chancellor. Elena's voice carried a finality that cut through his protests. We're not sacrificing ourselves for ungrateful species. We're sacrificing ourselves for the idea that existence has meaning, that consciousness is valuable, that the universe is better when sentient beings choose hope over despair. She paused, seeing the incomprehension in his eyes. You still don't understand, do you? This was never about gratitude. It was never about getting something in return. It was about proving that some things matter more than individual survival. Elena closed the communication and turned back to her crew. They were watching her with expressions she'd seen countless times before on human faces. The quiet determination that came when people decided to do the right thing regardless of the cost. All stations, final status report, she called out. Engines at maximum overload threshold, her chief engineer reported. We'll have approximately 30 seconds after initiation before containment failure. Weapon systems offline. All power redirected to overload pattern, came from her tactical officer. Life support maintaining minimum levels, reported the environmental systems officer. Emergency evacuation pods are... Well, Captain, there's nowhere to evacuate to. Alina nodded. She'd expected that. This wasn't a battle where anyone was supposed to survive. This was a statement, a declaration by nearly 12,000 crews that meaning and purpose were more powerful than hunger and despair. Captain, Doctor, Webb called out. I'm reading temporal distortions around the eternal positions. I think they're preparing to act. Alina looked out at the space around them, where reality itself seemed to be shifting as beings that existed partially outside time prepared to intervene in the flow of events. The Devourers were less than 10 minutes away now, their massive forms blotting out entire star fields. All ships. Alina broadcast on the fleet-wide communication network. This is our final transmission. In 5 minutes, we will initiate synchronized reactor overload. Every ship in this fleet will cease to exist. But our sacrifice will create something that has never existed before. Proof that consciousness, meaning, and purpose are more powerful than any force in the universe. She paused, looking around her bridge at faces she'd worked with for years, people who had become more than crew. They had become family. To the families and loved ones who will remember us, know that we go gladly into this final act. We are not dying for any nation or species or ideology. We are dying for the idea that existence itself is sacred, that consciousness is precious, and that the universe is infinitely better when filled with beings who choose love over hate, hope over despair, sacrifice over selfishness. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, thinking of her great-great-grandmother Anna, who had saved beings she'd never met with nothing but ingenuity and compassion. She thought of the countless humans who had made similar choices over the centuries, who had proven again and again that humanity's greatest strength was not its technology or its military might, but its capacity for caring about others.
Begin final countdown, she commanded.
The next 4 minutes passed both infinitely slowly and impossibly quickly. Elena watched the tactical display as each ship in the massive fleet confirmed their readiness for simultaneous detonation. She listened to final messages being transmitted between vessels, words of farewell, expressions of friendship, statements of purpose that transcended species barriers. But the most remarkable thing was what she didn't hear. No panic, no despair. No last-minute attempts to flee or find alternatives. Nearly 12,000 ships from 200 species, all facing annihilation with the quiet dignity that came from knowing their sacrifice had meaning. 10 seconds, Captain, Dr. Webb reported. All ships reporting ready. Elena looked out one final time at the constellation of ships surrounding her, each one containing beings who had chosen to answer humanity's call for help, who had decided that some things were worth dying for. Execute, she commanded. What happened next defied every scientific instrument's ability to record it properly. 12,000 ships simultaneously overloaded their reactors in a pattern designed not for maximum destruction, but for maximum meaning. The energy release was enormous, equivalent to a supernova, but it was the intention behind the release that mattered. Elena felt her ship beginning to come apart around her as the reactor breach reached critical levels. But even as the bridge filled with alarms and her crew worked frantically to maintain power for the final few seconds, she could see something unprecedented happening on the sensor displays. The Devourer entities had stopped completely. Their biomechanical forms were writhing in what could only be described as confusion, their feeding tendrils recoiling as if burned. For the first time in millions of years, they were encountering something they couldn't process, the willing sacrifice of thousands of beings for the sake of others they'd never meet. And in that moment of confusion, the Eternals acted. Elena's last coherent thought before her ship's final destruction was watching reality itself bend around the Devourer entities, as beings that existed outside time reached back to the moment of their entry into this universe and simply adjusted their trajectory. Not destroying them, but redirecting them to a universe where they belonged. One where entropy had already claimed everything, where despair was the only truth, where there was nothing left for them to consume or corrupt. The explosion of 12,000 ships should have been visible across half the galaxy. Instead, there was simply a moment of perfect silence, a pause in the universe's heartbeat as the sacrifice registered across dimensions. When the light faded and space returned to normal, the Devour entities were gone. Not destroyed, but translated back to their own dying reality where they could feed on meaninglessness without threatening universes where hope still existed. But something else had changed too. Where the massive fleet had once been, there now floated a single message beacon, broadcasting on all frequencies in every known language. This is the final transmission of the Allied Defense Fleet. We were 12,000 ships from 200 species, united not by fear or necessity, but by the simple belief that existence has meaning beyond individual survival. We chose to prove that consciousness is precious, that purpose is powerful, and that some things are worth any sacrifice. To those who will remember us, know that our sacrifice was not an ending, but a beginning. We have proven that when sentient beings choose hope over despair, cooperation over competition, love over hate, no force in the universe can stand against them. The galaxy is yours now. Make it worthy of what we died to defend. Humanity never forgot a favor. The galaxy answered our call. Together, we changed everything. Across the galaxy, the message was received by countless species on thousands of worlds. Some were species that had fought alongside the fleet. Others were civilizations that had never heard of humanity before. But all of them understood the magnitude of what they were witnessing. The largest act of faith in galactic history. Performed not by conquerors or politicians, but by ordinary beings who had chosen to believe that existence had meaning. On Earth, in the halls of the Human Federation, Admiral Chen stood before a wall of memorial plaques bearing the names of every human who had died in the defense of the galaxy. 12,000 names from across human space, all added to the billions who had made similar choices throughout humanity's history. But Elena Vasquez's plaque bore a special inscription, one that would be read by countless generations of humans and aliens alike. Captain Elena Vasquez. She remembered that humans never forget a favor and reminded the galaxy why that matters. Years later, when historians tried to understand how a relatively minor species had managed to unite nearly 200 civilizations in the largest sacrifice in galactic history, they would focus on technology, strategy, and political maneuvering. But they would miss the real answer. It was never about being stronger or smarter or more advanced than anyone else. It was about being the kind of species that saved dying refugees without asking for anything in return. It was about being the kind of people who remembered kindness and repaid it 1,000-fold. It was about proving again and again that consciousness was precious and that existence had meaning beyond individual survival. Humanity had never forgotten a favor, and in the end, that simple truth had saved the galaxy. The universe was vast and dangerous, filled with forces that could consume worlds and entities that fed on despair. But it was also filled with beings capable of choosing hope over fear, sacrifice over selfishness, meaning over meaninglessness. And as long as that choice remained possible, no hunger could devour the light of consciousness. No entity could feed on the purpose that made existence worth defending. The galaxy had learned why humans never forgot a favor. Now it would spend the next 1,000 years learning to follow their example.